Okay, welcome back, Apes. This is screencast number 5 to Chapter 7, Environmental Policy, Making Decisions and Solving Problems. So we were talking about the early U.S. environmental policy, and I had said that it was done in 3 periods, and we ended getting ready to talk about the Homestead Act, the General Mining Act, and the timber culture. So the Homestead Act was established in 1862, and this allowed any citizen to claim for a $16 fee 160 acres of public land by living there for 5 years and cultivating the land or building a home. And those who could pay $176 were granted a waiting period of only 14 months for this land. The General Mining Act of 1872, and your book says 72 and the PowerPoint says 78. We'll have to look that one up. Legalized and promoted mining by private individuals on public lands for just $5 per acre. They were subject to local customs, and they had no government oversight. And this law is still on the books today, so it's a prominent law that we still follow. And then the third was the Timber Culture Act of 1873. And this granted, again, another 160 acres to any citizen promising to cultivate trees on 1/4 of the area of that land, 25% of that 160 acres. So these were some early policies that were put into place. The second wave of U.S. policy actually encouraged conservation. In the late 1800s, as the continent became more populated and its resources were increasingly exploited, the public perception and government policy towards natural resources began to shift. This reflected the emerging conservation and preservation ethics in American society, and the laws of this period aimed to alleviate some of the environmental impacts of the westward expansion. So that's what it was for. In 1872, Congress designated Yellowstone as the world's first national park. In 1891, Congress authorized the president to create forest reserves in order to prevent overharvesting and to protect forested watersheds. In 1903, President Theodore Roosevelt created the first national wild refuge, and these acts enabled the creation of a national park system, national forest system, and a national wildlife refuge system that still stand as global models today. These developments reflected a new understanding that the West's resources were exhaustible and required legal protection. The land management policies that continued through the 20th century targeted soil conservation after the Dust Bowl years, and wilderness preservation, and the Wilderness Act of 1964, which sought to preserve pristine lands untrampled by man, and where man himself could be a visitor in those areas. So these are some of the public policies. Theodore Roosevelt was one of the biggest in protecting any natural areas. When we look at the third wave, this came to the mid to the late 20th century. And this was a period where the nation was more densely populated. It was driven by technology and heavy industry. Intensive resource consumption happened during this time, and Americans found themselves better off economically, but living amid dirtier air, dirtier water, and more waste and more toxic chemicals. So during the 1960s and 1970s, several events triggered an increased awareness of environmental problems, and this brought about a shift in public priorities and important changes in public policy. A landmark event happened in 1962 with the publication of a book called Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, and we will be watching, I have this on video, and we're going to have to find a place where we can watch it together, but we will be watching Silent Spring. Silent Spring awakened the public to the ecological and health impacts of pesticides and industrial chemicals. The book's title refers to Carson's warning that pesticides may kill so many birds that few would be left to sing in springtime. In the video, you're going to watch people are sitting at picnic tables eating their lunch, and people are coming through and they're spraying pesticides as they're eating, like it's something really safe. It's through this that we learned that DDT was killing our American eagle, that their shells weren't able to develop properly, so that when the mother laid the eggs and sat on the shells would crack, or bacteria or some virus was able to get in and destroy the embryo. So that's where all of this came from. In Ohio, they have a river called the Cayuga River. This drew attention to the hazards of pollution. The Cayuga was so polluted with oil and industrial waste that the river actually caught fire near Cleveland a number of times in the 1950s and the 1960s. And this spectacle, coupled with an enormous oil spill off the Pacific coast near Santa Barbara, California in 1969, moved the public to prompt Congress and the President to better safeguard the environment and public health. So the first Earth Day was celebrated in 1970, and that helped to galvanize the public support for action to address pollution problems. Today, here's Rachel Carson that you can see in this picture, and there's the Cayuga River that was on fire. Rachel Carson's a neat lady, one of my heroes. Today, largely because of policies enacted since the 1960s, our health is better protected and our nation's air and water is considerably cleaner than what we had before. One of the foremost U.S. environmental laws that we have is the National Environmental Protection Act, or the NEPA. This was signed by law by Republican President Richard Nixon in 1970. It created an agency called the Council of Environmental Quality, and it required that an environmental impact statement, an EIS, be prepared for any major federal action that might significantly affect environmental quality. And the environmental impact statement is a report of results from detailed studies that assess the potential impacts on the environment that would likely result from the development of a project undertaken or funded by the federal government. So the environmental impact statement process forces the government agencies and businesses that contract with them to evaluate the environmental impacts before proceeding with any new dam, highway, or building project. And it uses a cost-benefit approach and generally does not halt development projects. However, it does provide incentives to lessen environmental damage. The National Environmental Protection Act grants ordinary citizens input in the policy process by requiring that environmental impact statements be made publicly available and that the public can comment on them by solicited or unsolicited consideration. So they can be part of the process. President Nixon's executive order also created the Environmental Protection Agency, and that happened, I don't know what year, in the 70s. I don't have the year down, but his policies created that. It has to be the 70s. And what this does is the EPA conducts and evaluates research. It monitors environmental quality, and it sets and enforces standards for pollution levels. It assists the states in meeting these standards, and it educates the public. The APA is part of the executive branch, and it operates in the line with policies of the president. As such, the EPA under one president may function very differently from the EPA under a different president. The EPA employs many dedicated scientists to carry out careful research and make scientifically informed policy recommendations. They advise administrators appointed by the president, and the policy decisions are ultimately made by these politically appointed administrators. So that's how the EPA works. So with that, there were other laws that followed. The first one is the Clean Air Act. And by the 1960s and 1970s, air pollution in the United States from automobile traffic and industries had become very severe. So this prompted the Clean Air Act of 1963. And this helped to turn our situation around. It set standards for air quality and imposed limits on emissions from new sources, and it enabled citizens to sue violators for pollution. And it established an emission trading program for sulfur dioxide, and these measures have improved our air quality. The next is the Endangered Species Act, and this happened in 1973. There was a lot of habitat loss and other pressures from people moving and settling, and this actually drove a number of species extinct or were threatened to become extinct. So the Endangered Species Act was passed to protect species that were threatened with extinction. It forbids the destruction of individuals of listed species or their habitat on public or private land, and it provides funding for recovery efforts. And there have been subsequent agreements that allow for negotiation with private landowners in dealing with the endangered species. Then came the Safe Water Drinking Act in 1974 because waterways like the Cayuga River were being fouled with pollution, and groundwater and aquifers across the nation were becoming contaminated with industrial waste. The Safe Drinking Water Act was authorized by the EPA to set quality standards for tap water and provided by public water systems, and to work with states to protect drinking water sources from contamination. And then we had the Toxic Substances Control Act of 1976, and this is where industrial chemistry had advanced, and they began to produce more and more novel chemicals for the industrial use and consumer use. And through virtually no adequate testing, they found that there was potential hazards to them, and they posed too much of a risk. So the Toxic Substance Control Act of 1976 was established, and it directs thousands of industrial chemicals that are manufactured to be monitored, and anything coming into the United States to be monitored as well. There's just so many chemicals that it's really hard to regulate, but they continue to try to regulate them. Okay, we're going to come back to the screen. We're coming to the end of this screencast, so I will see you in the 5th.